June 22nd ad hoc meeting of the Ad Hoc Arts Committee. I'm Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem, serving at large and chair of the committee, and I have my committee colleagues online if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then I'll have the staff in the room introduce themselves.
Braxton Winston, serving at large.
Malcolm Graham, District 2.
Mr. Bakari, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Tarek Bakari, District 6.
Is Mr. Driggs on yet? Mr. Driggs, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, I just logged in. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll go ahead and have staff introduce themselves.
Julia Martin, City Manager's Office.
Holly Eskridge, Economic Development.
Tracy Dodson, City Manager's Office and Economic Development.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Ms. Kelly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Stephanie Kelly, City Clerk.
Sitting in the back row does not get you off the hook for introducing yourselves. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over, but just preface it with saying that this is an ad hoc committee group, so we haven't established regular committee meetings for anybody who's watching this and is trying to figure out where we're going with this, so it's been a little bit free-form. We had to get the budget passed first, and as we know, the council committed to increasing funding for the arts from $3.2 million to $4 million, which is really exciting. We'll also be using $2 million from our CARES Act money annually, and with that fulfilled our commitment, whereby the private sector then stepped up also and have raised over $20 million for the next 3 years. So we've got a really great start for ourselves with that, but now we got to start building the plane. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Dodson for continue.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. If we can go ahead and pull up the presentation. And I think you're exactly right? We had an incredible start to this. We've identified the funds, and now we need to kind of put the structure and the governance around it moving forward. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to kick off this first couple of slides, and then I'm going to kick it to Julia and Holly. I am double booked for another meeting, and so I will slip out. But the real thing I wanted to make sure that we set the stage for before I turned it over to them was kind of getting the feedback on recommendations that we have today for the advisory board and what that structure wants to look like so that we can really get that board established and moving. And then, the next step beyond that would also be to identify who the commissioner will be as well. And so where we need your feedback today is what we are proposing for the composition and the role of the advisory board and how we think it should be structured. Next slide. So I will turn it over to you guys to hit onto the funding and where we are and our recommendations.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. So this is just a reminder for everyone about what was approved in this year's budget, including the plan that was presented to council over the course of the FY 2022 budget deliberations. Just a small change that you'll see. So $6.3 million, those are for the 38 organizations that have received operating grants from the Arts and Science Council in FY 2020 and FY 2021. Each organization will receive the higher of those two amounts with one change. We're adding another $150,000 for the Gantt Center. So they'll receive a total of $351,000, a little bit more than that in FY 2022. We also have, go back quick, thank you. We also have $800,000 unrestricted for the Arts and Science Council, and then $500,000 for $250,000 each for cultural vision grants and individual artist grants. You'll notice the top box there. There's still $4.4 million of this year's funding, both public and private, $6 million each, that is unallocated. And then before we go to the next slide, you'll see the gray bar in the middle that is the cultural plan, and then the dotted boxes after that. And so, really I think consistent with what's been said previously, the cultural plan will really guide how those funds are allocated in future years. And so I have 12 million plus one. Not to confuse people, everyone committed to $12 million per year. But as Mayor Pro Tem mentioned, the private sector has already outdone themselves. And so it looks like now just a little bit more than 20 million has been raised by the private sector. Next slide, please. So today we'll talk about some of the staff recommendations for the actual structure of the advisory board in advance of a request for council approval on June 28th. And the reason we wanted to, this is, kind of as fast as we could do this, going off of the budget adopted on the 14th, and we want to make sure that we can work while council's on break, so to speak. And so if council can approve this on the 28th, we can advertise for the positions, and then when council returns from break, we can actually have nominations. And so the board composition, we're going to recommend 18 members, and then the role of the board, again, consistent with what's been said over the last couple of weeks, develop the cultural plan, serve as community representatives, and then responsible for allocating the remaining funding in FY 2022 and the money going forward in FY 2023 and FY 2024. Next slide, please. So we took a look at a couple of other cities across the nation in terms of their arts and culture advisory boards and how many members do they have. We also took a look at the appointment allocation. So you can see, it's a pretty diverse spectrum of appointees from San Diego. They're all by the mayor. Durham has an interesting mix of city council and commissioners. Seattle's a little bit more prescriptive. But these cities were selected, to kind of give us some peer cities in terms of Dallas and Nashville, fellow North Carolina cities, and then San Diego and Seattle, I think are two. San Diego has had an arts and culture advisory board since the late 80s, so a relatively long-standing process where they have an arts and culture advisory board make recommendations and allocations to the mayor and city council. And then just one thing to note before we move on, not every city has an arts and culture advisory board. So for example, we looked at Boston. They do not have an arts and culture advisory board. They have a relatively robust city office that helps allocate their public art and things like that, but not every city has this arts and culture advisory board.
I'm sorry, Julie, does
Yeah.
that mean completely separate from the city? Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So yes, so there's no council appointments or mayor appointments for any kind of advisory board. Yes.
Okay.
And then getting a little bit more prescriptive. So looking at the 18-member board, again, this is, what has been said over the last several weeks, where half of the appointments would be from the private sector, half of the appointments would be to the public sector. Only one designation, one of the private sector appointments would be for the Arts and Science Council. And then consistent with our city council practice, I believe, the mayor would receive a third of the public sector appointments and council would receive 6. We're recommending that all of the board members serve for 1 3-year term. Again, in talking with the clerk and Emily Kunze, who now works in the manager's office, it takes a little bit of time to really understand your role on the board. And so, we had talked about what about 2 18-month terms, and I think the message was you really want to have these people kind of gel and get some cohesion amongst themselves for the next 3 years. And you don't want someone to just kind of really understand their role and then have their term be up. And so we're recommending for the duration of this, we're on an interim funding plan in a kind of interim board, having all the members remain as consistent as possible, obviously with the exception of when vacancies come up and things like that. Critically, the board will be representative of the community, and I think this is kind of the most important bullet on this slide. So, we encourage everyone to go onto the clerk's office when these appointments are posted. Artists, creatives, cultural institutions, and organizations across the spectrum, community members at large who are interested in this work. This board will be representatives of the community, and they will be representative of the community. And then the final thing, we're recommending that the mayor appoint the chair for this board. And then the final thing, what is the role and charge of this board? It's pretty specific. And so the Arts and Culture Advisory Board will work with the Arts and Culture Officer and the community, and it is those 3 bullets: develop a comprehensive cultural plan, determine the allocation of the remaining $4.4 million in the upcoming fiscal year, and determine the allocation of the at least $12 million in each FY 2023 and FY 2024. With that, next slide, I'll turn it over to Holly.
Okay, thanks, Julia. I really appreciate that. So what I'm about to go over here, this is actually just talking to some of the peer cities that Julia listed on the previous slide, and some of the staff members who have worked on these cultural plans in their different communities. And just kind of, we picked out some common themes that we're hearing. I don't think after, being a part of this group and listening to the conversations that you've had, and then I know there's been some in the community as well, that any of this will be anything that surprises you. I think it just reinforces the leadership that you all are already exemplifying. So I would say the first thing that we saw is this really needs to be community driven, and that trust is essential. You got to build it and you have to maintain it, and that has to be something that is a continuous focus throughout the entire planning process. So that's us as a city government organization, you all as the elected officials that are leading this organization, the commissioner, the advisory board. Trust is paramount, and it's all we're all responsible for it. And that representation in this planning process must represent the actual community. I know Julia talked about the board needing to represent the community, but everything that we engage as far as this planning process goes must be representative of the community. So you've got to have the independent creatives, the grassroots organizations, the community at large, the cultural institutions, the donor community. And that's why I think the board, not to go back to that point, has to have people on the board that can pull in those different community groups and parts of the ecosystem. We must have measurable community engagement action plan. So this is something that as part of the Arts and Culture Plan RFP, we will be putting that in there. And the plan must be Charlotte specific. So one thing that we heard is that pulling in, it's fine to do some best practices from other places, that's important, but really making sure that it fits Charlotte and the unique qualities of our ecosystem here. The next point is lead with equity. I know this is something you all have talked about. It must be the foundation of any strategy that's developed. It's not just the process that's engaged in developing the strategy, but it's the strategy itself. And with that said, there needs to be equity-based performance measures as a part of the strategy as well. So any kind of recommendation that comes out of it, that there will actually be something that is measurable from an equity standpoint. And then we really need to continuously and intentionally communicate the equity priorities. Next slide. So research and data is key. One of the things that is common is that really going in and understanding baseline data about what the Charlotte's arts and culture ecosystem looks like. This has been done in other cities. It really gives us a feel for understanding what exists out there, the strengths, the opportunities for growth, et cetera, and that then what we are able to do is we're able to say, how are we going to track that data moving forward? So as this plan develops these recommendations, they're adopted, they start to be implemented, how are we tracking the data to know the impact that we're actually having on our ecosystem? And then obviously here, the recommendations, any implementation strategy must be data-driven based on those first 2 points, and that qualitative and quantitative data is important to this process. And then the last point is transparency is critical. So really, this advisory board must be the ambassadors of this arts and culture plan. There has to be a regular commitment to communication with all stakeholders. I think that goes back actually to my first point in the community-driven slide, and that there must be measurable community engagement plans. So that reinforces that as well. We must track the communication and sort of, I said, marketing throughout the project itself. And then the most important thing that we heard repeatedly over and over is don't rush the planning process. On average, we're finding these take about a year to do. But they said really doing it with the right length of time is critically important because it takes that long. If you do it right, and it takes time to do the community engagement element for the plan itself. So next slide. So today we are asking this committee to make a recommendation about the advisory board and that it be placed on the June 28th agenda. Then the council, if that is the recommendation, the council will establish the Arts and Culture Advisory Board on the 28th. In July, the positions for this board will be advertised. Staff will also be developing an RFP for the cultural plan. And then in August, you all will be voting on the Arts and Council Advisory Board members.
Arts and Culture,
Did I say that one? What did I say? Sorry.
Arts and Culture Advisory Board members.
Arts and Culture Advisory Board members. My apologies if I said that incorrectly. So that is the end of the presentation. We'll turn it back over to you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead right into questions. We have Mr. Bakari has a question.
Yeah, and I think it's probably more of a comment. So there's a lot I like in what I've seen here, but I think there's one fundamental thing that I think we need to discuss deeply because it goes against our initial design, at least for the beginning, of how we were going to innovate and do something a little differently. And it really centers around the difference between the commissioner role and the board. So this was obviously very heavy about the board, right? And you see in the timeline we're looking at right now, establish the board. And then you go back also to the slide before, which is a couple slides before, which is the mandate of the board, right? So while the board is 50% of the importance of how we succeed in this first 3 years, which the first 3 years are the startup phase of this new idea. The other big 50% balance of that isn't kind of weighed into this approach is the absolute critical nature of that commissioner role. So in my opinion, one, establishing the commissioner before even calling for the nominations for the board is critical because, and I'll steal words from Councilman Winston before, we must have an approach where it's not just like, all right, who do we know? And it's kind of a cattle call for board members. It's very specific across a sampling across all the different aspects we need. And the best way to do that is the best way we've come to do it across our other 30 plus boards and commissions, which is the boards itself, the groups itself, the experts themselves tell us, this is what I need and this is what I'm missing. We still have the authority and accountability to nominate, but at least we're doing that. That commissioner is the CEO of this new venture and the one throat to choke in order to experiment and make something new, just not make another same thing with a different name going forward. So that's number one, leading with the commissioner. And number two, if you can go back to the slide of the commission's, of the board's role, so we can look at that. A couple slides back, like a little more, role of the board. So develop, go ahead, back to that slide you were just on. Develop cultural plans, serve as community representatives, allocate remaining. So the reason we called this a board of advisors and not a board of directors was because the sampling of the community, so important, individual artists and different kind of folks there, those viewpoints coming in, 18 members are very important, but those are advising elements to a CEO, to a commissioner, to be able to then say, okay, now here's what we're going to do. And that doesn't mean it needs to exist like that forever, but in these first couple years, the strength of who we hire into that commissioner role and their ability to play CEO to get this new venture up and running is so critical. So I think the two recommendations I would strongly make based on the design of this originally is one, instead of develop cultural plan, service community representatives is fine, or allocate remaining, it really is serving as the advisors and the input to the commissioner on those items. And then also changing that timeline to be about getting the commissioner in place first and then moving forward with our board appointments.
Yeah, and to that point, and I do have Mr. Driggs and Mr. Winston, I just want to tack on to what Mr. Bakari is saying, that I've gotten feedback on from people in the community is that, and this might be something the other cities could weigh in on, is that advisory group, or call it, however we call it, steering committee, whatever, should those individuals then not be eligible for grants if they're making the grants? Like, that's kind of awkward, right? Because they could be some of the most knowledgeable people out there that are doing amazing things that we want to emulate, but then we say you can't apply for a grant. So the question is there even, would you have consideration for a separate way of making grants that does not, preclude those folks from participating. I don't know how
And
to,
Mayor Pro Tem, I would just add that I think that's another benefit of the original design of Board of Advisors, right? Which is that kind of strips out some of that squishiness there.
Right.
If there is a commissioner that ultimately is making a call, because those are the people we want are the very ones who may need the grants, right?
Right.
And so I think that's another great point that kind of aligns to the Board of Advisors type setup for this.
and so you're saying, Mr. Bakari, and I don't really see where that is in this process, but you're saying that you think it's critical to get that commissioner in place before we, the council, start taking nominations for the board and making those appointments?
Absolutely, because if we're putting this amount of weight and responsibility, the commissioner, in my opinion, will be the thing that either makes this amazing, successful, or back to the drawing board in 3 years. So setting a board before that commissioner has a chance to tell us their vision and what types of expertise they need would almost be taking out a huge chunk of the value that board is going to provide that commissioner. So I very much believe that.
Okay, that's good feedback. Holly, I don't know if you have anything to,
Sure, actually, today we were focused on the board, honestly, the advisory board. The commissioner is absolutely front and center in everything that we're talking about right now. I don't think the timeline, we will definitely bring this back, but I don't think the timeline that you're talking about, Councilmember Bakari, is off from what we're trying to work internally. So thank you for saying that. And we definitely, that is front and center on everything that we are doing. For today, we want to talk about the advisory board, but thank you for bringing that up. Really appreciate it.
okay, thank you, Mr. Driggs, and then Mr. Winston.
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions. And some of these we may not need to resolve. I think we have a short-term need to agree on this board, these couple of bullets. But there are questions. For example, would the commissioner and the board have the final decision about the allocation and grants, or would there be some sort of a final sign-off by the council and the private funders as we do with CHOIF?
It is
Holly, do you have?
it is the intent that the board is the one making the allocations.
Okay. Will there be any staff, or is it just the commissioner and then this 18-member group doing the work?
I'm certain staff would be involved in terms of, even thinking about releasing an RFP. So it will, this person will not be out on an island on their own. They will be a city staff person. And so, they will collaborate with the city just as I would as one person in the city manager's office. So yes.
We had talked before about economic development and tourism as being one of the reasons for these investments, or at least a hope that we had. There doesn't seem to be any reference to that. So are we making any connection between the arts community and those goals, or is this now completely separate? I wish we had Tracy here for that one, because that's her
I
bailiwick.
kind of feel like that's what this conversation is about today. And, that's a great point, Mr. Driggs. Do we want someone from CRVA to be a part of this? So that, I think we have to sort of give the staff the guidance on what we had envisioned.
I mean, we're going to have conversations at some point, and I think we have to have a council conversation about what the goals are. And do we have performance metrics? Is there any aspect of the activity and the use of these funds that should lead to observable or measurable outcomes? Or do we just sort of put the money out there and we're happy to have a well-funded arts community? I think there needs to be a little accountability around it. We do have the issue of the big box venues and what the status is of their funding. Will there be any kind of provision for protection of funding for them, or is that not part of the plan? And these are all things we need to talk about. Again, I don't know that we have to resolve them at this meeting. Last point is, I don't think we want this entire 18-member group to turn over all at once every 3 years, which means we should probably institute some sort of a transition to staggered terms after an initial period. I mean, we're going to put them all in place at once, and then maybe after 2 and 3 and 4 years, we have new members, 6 new members appointed, so that there is some continuity on the body. I don't think we want a whole new group starting from scratch every 3 years.
So two points. Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. So the first is that's a really good point on the terms for the advisory board. What we were looking at is when we did the 3 years, we really were trying to say sort of what Julia put up that slide with the funding plan, that board would be looking at those 3 years of funding. But what we didn't want to do is get out in front of you all. We wanted to actually have the plan itself done so that there were the recommendations in the plan that could inform how you would want to do what you just talked about, as far as like a board moving forward, what that structure would look like. And then we could make those adjustments. That's absolutely something that we have thought through and will be getting back to you all on. But we thought maybe the recommendations from the cultural plan itself would be helpful in figuring out where that should go beyond those 3 years. And then as far as the data that you were talking about, are we going to track performance metrics, et cetera? Those are really good points, everything you brought up. I will say that this plan is completely going to be data-driven. We haven't hammered out exactly what types of metrics. We will work on that as part of the RFP planning process. What I will say is, though, that when you really are trying to understand the data and understand what Charlotte's arts and culture ecosystem looks like, it's not just like what it's the economic impact side of it that you're talking about there is part of that information. And what I would say too is that when we're looking at this, it's that how is the city's money, how are we making sure that the city's money, and then the community's money really, but city's money I'm talking about right now, is being invested in a way that makes the greatest impact into our arts and culture ecosystem. And so there will be data that actually tracks that. That will be one of the requirements.
Right. It's just that is difficult because so much of what goes on in the arts doesn't really lend itself, right? I mean, it's subjective and it's qualitative. So I just hope that we'll at least be specific about addressing that. Is it the intention that council will approve the culture plan once it's developed?
I would imagine so. Yes, I would think so. Sorry, we hadn't even gotten there yet, being completely honest.
Yeah,
I think if we're going to proceed today, we need to know that we have further opportunities and we don't just sort of agree with the creation of this board and then we're not asked again as council. So I would want to see us have, if not approval of the proposed allocations and grants, some sort of ongoing participation as funders. And not just step away and write a check every year after that. And that's one of the reasons we got to this point. We were writing a grant check and didn't have governance over the Arts and Science Council. And all of this is happening because the city felt that we needed to involve ourselves a little more in how the arts funding was being used, especially after we increased the amount. So that, again, is not something we necessarily have to resolve today, but I just want to be clear that I think we should have some checkpoints in the future.
So I will say that absolutely. I mean, that is built into everything that we've been talking about from a staff level. We've been planning this process. We've been trying to look at it, in sections. So like, what does June through September look like? But making sure that you all are informed and understand where things are in the process. And then obviously when the commissioner or officer, I can't remember exactly what we're going to end up calling it, but when that position ends up coming on board, that you all have opportunities for regular communication as well. So that is paramount to this process.
Okay, last quick comment. I definitely think we should have a commissioner before we think about board appointments.
Could you repeat that?
I think we should definitely have a commissioner before we start thinking about board appointments.
Thank you.
I think the commissioner is going to be given the responsibility the commissioner has to have the ability to know what appointments are being made to the board and participate and advise us at least on those appointments.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Good points as well. Before I have Mr. Winston and then Mr. Graham, I just want to acknowledge that Mayor Lyles is on virtually too, so thank you for participating, Mayor Lyles. Mr. Winston, go ahead.
I think this is a good conversation. I think we also need to take a second to kind of step back and to, especially for the folks that are watching, to understand what we're being asked to do versus things that are necessary to do moving forward. I certainly believe an arts commissioner, the arts commissioner needs to be at the center of these decision-making processes. But we need to also, can somebody mute? I think so. I'm getting a crazy.
Mute the room, please.
But that arts commissioner, remember, is a personnel decision. We don't make those hires. The city manager makes that hire. So on Monday, we don't know, right? We don't know about those things. He could already have that person in mind in the hiring process. So I would ask staff to ask the manager on Monday, should we go forward with this, that he should give us some type of update on what that hiring process is looking like, and to kind of inform us how he plans to deal with that as much as he can. That, again, just to be clear for folks outside, that city council does not make personnel decisions, and this commissioner will be part of the city staff. So it does make sense why this personnel decision is not something that we are taking up in this conversation right now. But it is
Mr.
true.
Mr. Winston, could I make a quick comment to that? If the person we're hiring is going to be given final decision authority over the allocation of those funds, they are in a different situation from other people that report to the manager. And to that extent, I wouldn't necessarily regard it as completely analogous. This is not a normal member of city staff. If they are going out and making spending decisions, it can't be overruled by the manager or by us.
The manager I don't believe that it would not be overruled by the manager. But again, this is something we should talk about on Monday, because department heads certainly have the ability to spend much more than $12 million at during any given fiscal year.
Just keep the CHOIF model in mind. Just think
Okay,
about
let's
CHOIF.
go one at a time, please.
I think we should go. I think maybe this is a conversation that we should have. But the whole point of the way we're doing this and to keep politics out of this, and the reason that we have this commissioner and advisory board and committee structure is so that the city council is not making final recommendations about where the funding goes. That was specifically in the guidance that we gave, and what we how we've been communicating with the community. So I would definitely warn us against kind of changing that at this point in time. Let us also understand what staff is trying to do here. They are trying to get this ball rolling on July 1st when this fiscal year starts. Being that we are going to be going on break, if they don't have some type of direction and guidance to go in, this process automatically stops before it starts. And I think what staff is saying is that being that this is such an important topic, being that we're putting so much work into this, we want to get to work on this plan and this work now, right? In August. We don't want to be in a situation where this structure of a commissioner and advisory board comes together sometime in December or January. That is not the type of responsiveness that our community needs. That is not the type of guidance that council has given staff. So what I hear staff asking us is for guidance to get this process started. And as Mr. Driggs and Mr. Bakari pointed out, there's much more that we need to be engaged with. So I hope the idea, when they start putting out that information, when they start talking to the community in July, while we aren't meeting, about what the potential criteria is, their participation on the responsibilities of the advisory committee, they can do that, and we can come back in August, having a much more zoomed in conversation about those governance structures and things and things of that nature. But it is definitely within our purview on Monday. If we do have more specific guidance, if we should get this out of committee, that we should have that conversation on Monday for work that we'd like them to do in July while we're not working. So that, I think that's just real important. We want to keep that in mind. We want to get staff working on this. The question I do have is how will, and I understand we haven't necessarily thought this out yet, but we should think about this. How will the private sector's selection process be governed? And when I say governed, obviously we're not telling them how to make their selections, but we do want to avoid the situation where one voice that pays the most money, for instance, has the most clout at the table simply by default. What if somebody was to be dropped off and replaced? How do we govern those things so it isn't just the biggest donor gets the most outsized point at the table? I understand if you don't have that answer yet, but I think that's something that we need to think about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think Councilmember Winston kind of summed it up for me as well. I think what we need to do is begin to provide the public more input in terms of the direction that we're going. That starts with naming the advisory committee, advertising that committee while we're away for a month, so that when we come back in August, we can make the appointments. I'm almost certain that the manager is already thinking about who the commissioner will be, he or she, and how that selection is going to go. That's his decision, not ours. And so I think the outline as outlined by staff today makes sense for how we move forward. I think Councilmember Winston also asked very good questions about the selection process for the private sector as well. But I see no need not to take action today based on what's in front of us. It makes sense to me. It's comprehensive. It's laid out, I think, appropriately. Obviously, there are some questions that I still want to have answered in terms of the role of the board. We can discuss that later as well. But other than that, I think I agree with the points that Councilmember Winston has made thus far.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Graham. So I've taken notes of what everybody said, and it definitely helps me think through that as well. I support the idea that we need to know who the commissioner is, and that individual, presumably is somebody who has experience in the arts, but in organizing this kind of an effort, and they will have ideas as to what you need on that board. And so while we need to get the process going, I also think that we want the commissioner to weigh in on that. And, we do have historical examples of how to do this, right? With our affordable housing framework, for instance. Well, we do have more of a vote in who gets the money. However, staff, there's a process and there's a framework there that says what are the council values. And I think that has to be established at some point. What are the council values to the point of what part of this, are we working on tourism, getting people to come to Charlotte? What else is going to be baked into the overall framework that can be used as the decision-making process for how the money is distributed. The second thing that I haven't really heard, and I want to make sure that I understand, is we have a commissioner, but is the intention that that commissioner will eventually hire a consulting firm that does so? Not that this should be the group, but the only one I've seen really is Lord Resources. I know there's 2 or 3 national groups that other cities have used to really develop even ahead of the framework, develop what the priorities or the pillars of the community are. So one of the things that keeps coming up from our local arts community, and that some of you guys have brought up, and that has definitely come up in some of the other cities' pillars, is the need for affordable rehearsal space, storage space, performance space from some of our smaller organizations. That was one of the reasons that we wanted a new model, because we don't have a way to affect that right now. So that would come out, I would think, out of that effort of developing a arts and culture plan that has to be done professionally, independently, and with the help of that advisory group, or again, maybe we call it a steering committee. So, because I also would like input from that commissioner is how do you not cut people off from being advisors and still give them an opportunity to benefit from this new funding framework as well. So, you know, from a sequence standpoint, I do think we need to know who the leader is going to be. We can certainly start the process. We can give input as to what categories need to be on that board, right? Do we want an arts educator on that board? Do we, you know, we've said that we're going to have it represented from the Arts and Science Council. Do we want a CRVA person on that board? I think those are the things right now that we could be talking about, is the kind of categories, and then let staff work on it while we're gone, and not have an answer as to when that board exactly gets, you know, appointed. So just my thoughts.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, oh, I'm sorry, I see Mr. Bakari and then Mr. Driggs.
Yeah, let me just, and I like a lot of things I just heard. Let me just summarize, because I agree with the staff is already working. I know the manager has already been meeting with folks from a commissioner perspective. So letting them work and hit the ground running while we come back is the absolute right thing. I agree. And also agree that we could probably meet that timeline. So my tweak recommendations kind of to this deck and the way we've talked about it would be, by the time we leave, would be adjusting the deck to, again, lead with the commissioner in that timeline, followed by that commissioner's recommendations, and then the board appointments. And I think we can do all that in parallel, make a call for folks right away, but just making sure that we don't appoint all the board seats, which is one of our biggest roles as council and mayor and others like that, before that commissioner's had a chance to weigh in. I think the other thing, going back to the importance of not bifurcating the private sector funds and the decision-making versus the public, which is critical. If we settle on 18 board seats or whatever it is, I think there needs to be some mechanism where the private sector, since they're splitting the cost with us of, you know, the money for this, gets to select 9 seats from across the board. That way, again, as it's a board of advisors, it's the same commissioner and the same process, hearing from the same group, not trying to serve 2 different groups at the same time, which will be a setup for failure there. I think the other edit in the deck is change the wording on that slide that was up to, you know, from develop or allocate to advise commissioner, which I think is a critical role, but it's also a critical delineation between that and the CEO nature in these first 3 years of that board commissioner. And I'd also say that where our touch points are, I think, are on the front end and the back end. And it enables in the middle of it not to be, the commissioner not to be influenced by politics or the board, but they can really, in these first 3 years, put together this plan, yet we still influence it. On the front end, we need to get to work immediately and then in August in building that council values set, right? Because that's what the commissioner and the board then takes from us as one of multiple inputs and says, all right, how do we bake into our plan what they want? Then they're free to operate free of politics through the year. But then we have a look back process during each budget cycle, which is let us know how much you met our values through what you were doing. And then that's our influence by, in each of those funding cycles, understanding that we're trying to give a 3-year kind of runway to this commissioner group to set all those things up. So that would be my set of recommendations that would then get them running. Adjust the deck to lead with the commissioner, but stay with everything else in the timeline that's set. Change the wording from develop or allocate to advise commissioner, and then figure out on the front end how to incorporate the private sector's representatives onto that board of advisors, not to have some separate process where they're trying to serve two parties.
Thank you, Mr. Bakari. Mr. Driggs, and then Mr. Graham.
So concerning our private partners, I think one thing we need to recognize is that as we embark on this, the terms of our understanding with our private partner are critical. And that's why we need to have some of these conversations now, because if we have particular requirements that we would attach to our funding, then we need to, or the board appointments, as Mr. Winston pointed out, I think we need to establish what those are. The council does. And the council needs to then have in place an understanding with the private funders about how all this is going to work, because we don't want to discover later that their idea is different from ours. So that's why I'm pushing that we, as a council, establish some clarity about what the purpose is of our funding and how we will measure the success of our funding, and then line that up with the private guys so that the organization isn't working for two different masters with two different sets of priorities. There needs to be a kind of clear guidance from all of us about that. And Mayor Pro Tem, to your point about what about the grants to the board members, I think our council policies are pretty clear that that group cannot award grants to one of its members. If you just, by analogy to the rules that we play by, I could conceive of a situation where a member of the board submitted a financial partner type of application to the city or something like that, and somebody else considered their request. But I don't believe that even if the board member recused themselves, they could be awarded a grant by the others, because we have a rule that says that nobody does business with the city can be a city a member of city council. So we would need to kind of look at that pretty carefully in the context of rules that we already have about conflict and so on. But I also agree that the members of this thing are likely candidates for grants, and therefore that is an issue we'll need to address. But my most important point would be that we do get some clarity ourselves, and then reach agreement with our private partners before we get too deep into this and not discover that they're really only interested in funding the big boxes, for example, and we're out here wanting to water the kind of the grass of the landscape.
Sure.
So in terms of today, if we could go back to the original action request on the slide.
Do we have an action request? Well, the action request is to ask for a request for council action on June 28th. But I don't know the exact wording of what our council action is, just to give staff the ability to start working on the board.
It would be
There wasn't anything. Is this the only language we have that relates to what we're being asked to do today?
It would be to establish the board with 18 members as laid out on the slide. It would probably, if we could go to slide.
I thought there was an earlier slide.
It would be a combination of slides 6 and 7 is what the RCA would say.
So I think the difference is that we're saying we're not ready to establish the board. I think we're probably ready to get some more clarification around, and Mr. Winston, I see you after Mr. Graham. So I don't know. I mean, I think we all have some question marks out there that we need answered before we establish the board. One being, what's the timing of the appointment of the commissioner? I think that's a big one.
So if I could establishing the board at the end of June just enables us to begin to advertise for the positions. Council does not have to necessarily vote on the nominations in August. It just starts the process. So if we don't have a commissioner in place, which I expect we will by early August, and and you don't feel comfortable with the input you've received from them, you don't have to vote on these nominations in early August. You can vote on it on the 9th. You can vote on it on August 23rd. There's opportunities. You're not wedded to, if we do this on the 28th, then you must come back on the 9th and do this. This just enables us to start the process and get those nominations rolling.
So,
So, Madam Chair, sorry, I think I still have the floor.
I'm sorry.
I'm willing to make a motion that we proceed, and we need to think about the exact wording here, but I don't think there's broad consensus about the idea that there will be an 18-member board. And so I would like to try to crystallize what's in these slides as an action that we can take now in order to maintain momentum, and just know that what we're going to do is create this board. But at the same time, I don't want it to be sort of limiting or exclude us from involvement in, for example, negotiating with our private partners and working further to define in August what the mandate will be to that board, or what kind of parameters we want to establish for how this funding will be allocated, and agree with the private funders.
And I
So
think
that
we can
motion
accomplish
can-
that without addressing the money part of it.
Right, I think we
Mr.
could, yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Driggs, do you have more?
No, as I was saying, I would make a motion that this committee recommends to the full council that we establish a board in accordance with a couple of the bullet points on those slides. I can't see what the full motion looks like because the slides are jumping around on my screen here, but essentially I'm recommending that this committee proceed with the what we're hearing from the staff, and reserve our flexibility to address a lot of the other issues that have come up in this call. But we should take some action to establish this board.
Okay,
Second.
so that's a second from Mr. Winston. I still have comments from Mr. Graham and then Mr. Winston before we take a vote. Mr. Graham?
Yes, Madam Chairman, I think the staffer summed it up correctly. It does not prohibit us from moving forward with and I think that's captured in the motion, to start the process of advertising for the positions, giving the staff the momentum to move forward. I'm not sure what type of guidance the administrator will give the council in terms of who we should point to the board, other than what is obvious, I believe, that who should be there. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot of value of waiting to see who he or she may be before we decide to formulate the committee and how it should be populated based on the centers of influence in the community, within the arts community, and those interested in helping it grow. And so I hope that the motion captures what staff has outlined, and obviously if there's some T's that need to be crossed and I's that need to be dotted between now and August, we can, in terms of getting clarification from the manager in terms of the process for hiring the administrator, and or some of the detailed items that we are asking questions for. Hopefully that the staff can come back with some of those answers, so that when we do meet in August, we won't be, we can keep this as simple as possible, but obviously getting the answers that we need to satisfy all the council members. So I guess in a nutshell, let's try to keep it simple and not make this thing more complicated than it needs to be.
Thank you,
Mr. Graham, excuse me, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, but I forgot to mention, I texted the manager while we were talking about when he expected to have a commissioner, and he replied that in July.
Okay.
Just so we all know that, okay? That looks like a near-term thing.
Yeah, so that's why I think we ought to move forward. And again, hopefully that's captured in the motion, move forward with the recommendations that have been outlined by staff. I think they're reasonable. I think it captures the momentum that we want to move forward with. it certainly acknowledges the beginning of the fiscal year and the program year, July 1. And I think there's an expectation that we have within the community to bring them on board along with us as soon as possible. And so if the motion captures all of that, then I'm willing to support it. So is that what we're voting on, Madam Chairman?
That's my intent.
Yes, that was, I believe, Mr. Driggs' intent. And before we vote, we still have Mr. Winston, and then I just have a quick comment.
Yeah, we'll go quick. I actually got to get back to work. Yeah, we're basically voting to tell the staff to get to work. So I think that's what we should do, get to work. And just the one comment about appointments to boards and the ability to take part in the grant making. I think one of the things that we'll have to consider is actual state law and conflict of interest and things like that, because there are things that govern that way beyond our policy. So I'm a yes on this. We should talk to the manager. We should talk to the attorney on Monday. Thank you all. I got to go, but count me as a yes.
Okay, and you, even if we vote and you're gone, you're still a yes, so we know that. And
Yeah.
I just want to say that to staff, I want to make sure that we don't lose value.
Madam Chair, could we take the vote while Mr. Winston is there, or at least do it now? Because
He's gone,
I'm not
but
sure that-
he's a yes vote because he wasn't in attendance, so we can go ahead and take a vote. All in favor of Mr. Driggs' motion?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs, Ms. Bakari, Mr. Graham,
Yes.
and Mr. Winston. So that's unanimous by all 5 committee members. And so, thank you, Mr. Driggs, for structuring that motion. What I just wanted to say is that I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about this process and what we're doing is because there are so many incredible ideas out in the community, but there's also so much experience and knowledge that could be captured and brought into this. And whether it's a legacy organization like Children's Theater, I recently spoke with their new executive director who came from Orlando and shared with me what they do around cultural tourism grants. We don't do anything like that. That's a great idea. It could be somebody like On Cue Productions with Quentin Talley, or Lonnie and O.C. Davis with Jazz Art Charlotte, who really know how to build a small arts organization. You know, they came from New Orleans. I mean, I just really am struggling with the notion that we can't have them on a steering committee or giving advice and part of this process and then say, but you don't qualify because you have, like Jazz Art Charlotte really built the arts, the jazz community in Charlotte. So I don't know how we do that, and maybe the commissioner has a better idea, but certainly as we advertise these positions, we should be saying that we don't know that they can because of law, state law, as Mr. Winston points out. But, you know, there might, I don't know. I mean, I'm open to suggestions on that, but I would think you'd all agree that we know there are a lot of great ideas out there, and we don't want to preclude those people from benefiting in some way.
Mayor, Tim, can I comment? I just want
Yeah.
to say that is a really an excellent point, and let staff as well, let's see what we can research on our end just to see. I know that, for example, the city of Dallas, they really had a board that was small, but then they had like an extensive sort of steering committee.
Yeah,
That
stakeholders.
really, and that stakeholder group, they said was the only reason why their plan was as successful as it was, and that it was so supported by the community. So let us have some thought around that, you know, some more research. We'll talk to legal as well, just to kind of figure out how we can structure this and make sure that that commitment that you all have to really making sure everyone's at the table is fulfilled.
Okay, thank you. And for the people, the artists, I know we have some artists online watching. Think about that. I've had a conversation with the head of a small theater production company, and you know, maybe what it is that they get together and nominate somebody and let us know that collectively that sector of the industry is saying, we're going to recommend to council that this individual be on the advisory group. I think we really want to have as rich of a group as possible.
And I think, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that people can write in recommendations for specific individuals. So that is something that, you know, when you all see your nominations, we can include recommendations from whatever groups, are recommending a specific individual.
Okay. That's the charge for our committee today. If everybody, Mayor Lyles, I don't know if you had any comments you wanted to share, but thank you for joining us, and thank you to the committee for all your great ideas. We don't have anything set up yet for the next meeting, but we know it won't be till at least later July when we all get back. So in the meantime, thanks for the hard work. Thank you, staff, for
So,
your
Madam Chair,
great work.
Madam Chair, I just want to make sure that the clerk or the staff are able to formulate exactly what our motion was and what we will take to the full council. So again, the intent is that we will proceed in accordance with the recommendations from the staff as they appear in this slideshow. So can you pull that together so that we have something, so we know what it is that we're actually going to say to the full council?
Yeah, and you may, I probably won't be there on June 28th. I'm going to be on vacation, so I might have to have the vice chair actually put that forward. I don't anticipate this is going to be a problem getting this approved by council, but yeah, having that clear language ahead of time would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to look at that and just, make sure based on this conversation that it's sensitive to everything we said today. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor of adjourning, you can turn off your cameras. Thank you.
Bye-bye.